In 2004, Finnish-born Tor Lindqvist was the most experienced commercial square-rigged sailor still living. He had been around the most treacherous cape in the world, Cape Horn, 5 times between 1938 and 1945. Firstly in the big 4-masted bark Passat, and later in the Law Hill. He became the sailmaker in Law Hill, which prepared him to hand sew all the sails for Melbourne's museum ship Polly Woodside years later. For this he was awarded the Medal of the Order of Australia. And among other adventures, Tor had also spent 3 seasons in Antarctic whaling ships, sailing out of Cape Town. Gary found this great man living in a small flat in the Melbourne suburb of Chelsea. He began by asking Tor why he went to sea.
Oh, we used to go down and look at the ships. And there was a lot of small sailing ships came into the port in my hometown. There was barks, barkentines, schooners, mostly wooden ships. And the first big sailing ship that we saw was the Pommern. She came into the port in 1931, I think it was. And she was a big ship, the biggest ship ever to come into our little port. And that was my father took me down to have a look at the ship. I was only a kid then. And I thought to myself, it would be great to sail on this ship one day.
What made you go to sea?
Oh, I was a dropout from high school. And I didn't want to go back to school. So I said to my dad, I want to ship out. And I went down to the port and there was plenty of schooners there. I went on one of them, a little 3-masted schooner from the Åland Islands. And I asked the skipper for a job. He said, yes, you can sign on as a deck boy. And that was it. We loaded timber in my home port. And then we sailed to Denmark. And that took us about a month to get there. She wasn't a fast ship. She was an old wooden ship and she leaked a lot. We were pumping all the time. 1 hour at the wheel, 1 hour at the pumps. And that kept us going. And the food was bad. We went into Mariehamn for shelter, and there was the Passat laid up with many other square riggers. And I saw the Passat and the other ships. And I went to Gustav Eriksson's office and asked for a job. But it was too late for that season. So he said, you can have a job next year, the following summer, when the ships returned from Australia. And I got a job as deck boy in the Passat. Yes, we were loading timber in a small port at the head of the Gulf of Finland. And we sailed in a headwind. And we must have tacked ship about 20 times or something like that to get out of the Gulf of Finland. And that's where I learned how to tack a square rigger. But it was beautiful weather, smooth seas, so she tacked very well.
You must have learned a lot very quick doing that.
Well, you had to learn a lot quick. You soon learned the ropes when you handle them every day and you can see what they do. So quickly, in about a week or 2, you learned all the ropes. You had to. If you didn't, you were no good.
How many would there be to learn?
Oh, hundreds of ropes. Well, you knew which belaying pin they were belayed on. And you just felt there was no light there. During the night, you just felt with your hand the first belaying pin and the second and so on. And no problem.
Passat, was it 1938?
1938, that's right.
Can you just tell us?
That was where we sailed in late September from Mariehamn. And we got down to Copenhagen for stores, dry docking and stores and water. Then we sailed from there into the North Sea, and we hit bad weather right away. Nothing but gales and headwinds. And the master decided to go north of Scotland, north of the Shetland Islands. And we got out in the North Atlantic, and that's when the hurricane hit us. All of a sudden, like a shot. It blew out half a dozen sails or more. And the ship heeled over about 60 degrees. The ship was in ballast, and she heeled over until the water came up to the hatch coamings on the lee side.
Tell us about that.
The captain stood on deck for over 24 hours. He was lashed to the weather rigging. Whatever, he couldn't have stood on his feet. He was a very worried man. If the ballast had shifted, we would have been goners. But nothing shifted.
What about sea room?
Oh, we were on a lee shore. We had plenty of room. So he wouldn't want to run before the wind, because we would have ended up on the coast of Ireland or Scotland somewhere. So we kept close hold as well as we could. We put a tarpaulin and the jigger rigging to try and keep her into the wind, but that was impossible because we had no sails set. They all blew out. The chief steward would bring some coffee to the skipper and something to eat. He had to have something to eat when he stood there, and that was it. But we didn't have much time to look at the skipper. We were busy all the time. Things were going adrift and things blowing away. The tarpaulins went from the lifeboat covers blew away. The fire buckets blew away. It was a terrible mess. Tom Wells, he couldn't do anything with his camera while the bad weather lasted, because he was too busy working. But when the weather eased a bit, he got his camera out after the hurricane, and he got a few good shots. The sea looked like smoke. You couldn't see the horizon. You couldn't see anything. The sky and the horizon was in one like a whiteout. And that's the way it is in a hurricane. Oh, the noise of the wind in the rigging. It was a howling noise all the time. But you haven't got time to listen to that. That's there all the time. It was so bad that if you open your mouth to windward, you couldn't close it. And the skin, the flesh on your face, you would blow into. I wasn't afraid. I don't think somebody might have been afraid. We never had time to be afraid. And we didn't understand the dangers. We thought that was part of a seaman's life, which it was. Of course we knew it was dangerous.
Tell us about when you get down on the roaring 40s and the howling 50s, the dangers of being pooped and what being pooped is and what can happen.
Well, many a ship went down being pooped and overwhelmed with the seas. But in the Passat, we pooped. We had about 2 feet of water came over the poop, and that was nothing to worry about. And she was a very strongly built ship, so there was no danger from that. But some ships pooped very badly, like the Lowhill. Before I was in her, she lost her chart room twice from the poop deck by pooping. Well, that's when you run before the wind in a heavy sea, and the stern dips down, and a big heavy sea comes up behind. And she hasn't got time to lift her stern up, and then she poops. Well, a big sea up to perhaps 100 feet high breaks over the stern and washes everything away, everything that's loose. But that didn't happen to us, because we were lucky. We had a good ship in good trim. Well, then the hatches can get stove in and the ship might sink She might fill up with water, or she might broach to and turn over and go down. Many hundreds of ships were lost that way. The big sea coming up, I've heard of helmsmen leaving the wheel and running away when a big sea came up, and that could be the end of the ship. She could broach to, or she could lose her sticks, be caught aback. But steering from amidships, it was less dangerous. And in the low hill, of course, we had a wheelhouse down aft, so we were quite safe there. We had a southwesterly gale for days and days. Sometimes it would blow the hurricane force, and the sea got bigger and bigger. And when the ship is running down into the trough or the sea, the upper topsail would be without wind, hang slack, and that's over 100 feet up. So you can imagine the size of the waves. Very difficult steering. You had to move the wheel all the time, non-stop, and the ship would still yaw about a point or more each way.
Did you get warm steering?
Oh, you'd sweat, even in cold weather. It was hard work, running before the wind, or with the wind on the quarter, and the ship would roll a lot, 45 degrees or more each way. But being close hold, it was easy to steer, very easy. You would just move a spoke or two. Many a time we had a rope with a canvas loop over our shoulder, and the rope made fast to a ring bolt in the deck, so you couldn't be thrown over the wheel. Because men have been thrown over the wheel and broken their bones and perhaps been thrown over the side. So in bad weather we had this gadget, this lashing, to stop us. Somebody went over the wheel, I forget who it was, one of the fellows, and he broke his collarbone. Best day's run in the Passat was just over 330 nautical miles. And that was down somewhere between the Cape of Good Hope and Australia. And we had all the sails set and a fair wind on the quarter. And that was it. And then the skipper lost his nerve, and he started to take in sails, take in the royals and up at the gallants, and he got frightened. He didn't want to lose any more canvas because we had already loosed over 11 sail. The ship was shuddering. You could feel the strain from the rigging, from the mast onto the hull. It didn't worry us. We knew we had a strong ship, a very strongly built ship. We weren't worried about that. But everybody could feel the strain. And we used to go and feel the backstays, and they were bar tight.
Did you all enjoy sailing like that?
Oh yes. I thought that the skipper could have kept going like that for much longer. But of course I wasn't the skipper. Well, I think in a strong gale or a hurricane, the faster you sail, the better, because you more or less keep away from the heavy breaking seas. We used to batten down the hatches. We used to put all the hatchboards on, and we used to caulk them. The wooden hatchboards, we would caulk them with all bits of rope in between, the seam between the hatchboards. Then we would cover the hatch with 3 good tarpaulins and batten them down well. And we used to stitch them under the cleats, the battening down cleats. And we used to put 2 wedges like that on each cleat, hammer them in tight, and in the middle of it there was a small hole in the steel cleat, and we used to knock a nail in there so they couldn't come out. And on top of that, we used to cover the hatch with planks, with heavy 3x9 planks. And over that we used to lash it down with chains, crisscross. And tighten them as much as possible with rigging screws, bottle screws. And the hatches were so well battened down that if the ship had turned upside down, they wouldn't have come adrift. And that's the way they stayed until we got to port. Food was bad. No doubt about that. Nobody they liked the food. Of course, the officers' food was a little bit better. They got all the tidbits.
So what did it consist of?
Food, pea soup, salt meat, salt horse we call it, and tin food. When we ran out of potatoes, we had tin potatoes. No taste in them at all. The food could have been much better. But the chief steward bought the cheapest food he could get. But we had plenty of food, no shortage. There was no shortage of salt beef.
What was it like when it was dished up? Was it fatty? Was it
It was very stringy. We used to call it rope yarn. Very stringy and very tough. No taste in it. You tried to eat it, but you didn't enjoy it. I remember two of the boys went down. We had plenty of casks of salt beef up forward on the tween decks. And two of the guys went down there and got two of them on deck and threw them over the side a dark night. But that made no difference. We had so much of it. No end.
Did they hope if they got rid of it they'd get something better?
There was nothing better. The tin food was better. We had a little hatch from the galley to the cruise accommodation, and the cook would pass the food through there. And this salt horse, in fine weather, when the portholes were open, we used to throw it out the portholes and send for more, and there was no limit. Well, if, the cook put it in a big dish, what did we call them, a big Dixie, and put it on the table, and we used to help ourselves from there. We had our own plates and knives and forks, and we just scoop it in. And if we finished it all, we would get more from the galley. Fresh water was strictly rationed. We had one large bucket, I would say a 15-litre bucket per day for 10 men. So that was drinking water. But there wasn't enough to do the washing. We used to collect rainwater for washing ourselves and our clothes. Yes, in the Passat we had plenty of freshwater tanks. And we filled them in Copenhagen. And they lasted the whole voyage. And when we left Australia, the tanks were half empty or half full, whichever. And we never filled them up, we never topped them up in Australia. So we could then carry a little bit extra cargo. And they would load the ship down to a couple of inches below the plimsoll line. And perhaps we could carry an extra 100 tons of cargo. A few extra dollars for a ship owner. Well, there was nothing hot to drink at all during the night. So we made our own hot water by putting a jug above the glass funnel on the kerosene lamp and heat it that way. A very primitive way. And then we used to have our own cocoa and make hot cocoa in the middle of the night. The galley was locked during the night. We couldn't get in the galley.
Must have been bitterly cold at times too.
Oh, it was cold, very cold, cold and wet. But in those days we didn't feel the cold as much as I do now. One voyage we sighted 3 big icebergs, very near Cape Horn somewhere. And one of them was, I don't know how high, it might have been 1,000 feet high. It's hard to tell. But there was no danger, they were nowhere near us. And that's the only time I sighted icebergs from a sailing ship. We used to get what you call sea cracks on the sides of your fingers. You get deep cracks, and the salt water gets in there, and it hurts like hell. And they were very sore. And we used to try and wash our hands and put Vaseline in, but that didn't help. The best remedy was urine on your hands and on your neck, where you had oilskin chafe on your neck. That was good medicine. The worst thing was hauling on ropes. That hurt. When your hands are wet, and the ropes are wet with seawater, that hurt. Otherwise, scraping and rubbing didn't worry us so much. But when you had to haul on the ropes, which was continuous, well, that hurt. I remember that well. And we all the same. We all had the same problem. Your hands are ice cold, and your feet are wet and cold. Yes, we used to scrub the pin, anything that was varnished. We used to scrub all the old varnish away with caustic soda and sand and canvas. And it worked very well, but it would hurt if you got the caustic soda on your hands. So we tried to be careful not to get it on our hands. When you're up on the Royal Yard and the ship's rolling, I don't know, you travel a couple of 100 feet or something through the air in a few seconds. But you can work that out. You say you're 175 feet aloft and you roll 45 degrees each way, that's 90 degrees. That's just a bit of geometry to work that out. You just hang on and you get used to it. And the work goes on when you're furling sails. You don't stop and wait for the ship to stop rolling, because she doesn't.
Did you tell us once that you got fairly close to the water on one of the yard arms?
Oh yes, that was on the foreyard. There was two of us there, Carlson and myself, and she was rolling. And the ship was loaded. And I was right out on the yard arm doing something. I think I was shackling on the preventer sheet or something. And I said to Carlson, look at this, and I put my hand in the water. Well, furling a square sail in a gale can be very hard work. The sail is made of a double O canvas, which is very thick. And when it's wet, it's very stiff, and you try and get hold of it, and it pulls at your nails, and it blows out, and you lose it. Then you try and get hold of it again, and sometimes it bellies right back over the yard arm. And sometimes you have to get out of the way and sit down on the foot rope and wait for the squall to blow over, and then start again. And that was very dangerous. Of course, there were no safety harnesses, no back rope, just standing on the foot rope, hanging onto the jackstay. And these sails, they're fighting back. Well, we had no safety harnesses, we had no safety nets, we only had our arms to hang on with, and you had those strong arms, and that's the only thing that saved your life. We were furling the Crojack. We were about 8 men on the port yard arm, and we got the sail furled, and I was hauling away on the gasket, and there was a bit of slack on the gasket underneath the sail, which I didn't know, and it gave way, and I fell backwards. And how I got hold of the foot rope and the stirrup, I don't know, but I hung on to the foot rope, and I swung my legs up over the foot rope, and my 2 shipmates on either side hold me back up. So they helped to save my life. And if I had fallen, I would have landed on deck, and that would have been the end of me. So I was very, very lucky. And when I got back up on the foot rope, it just carried on regardless. But when I got down on deck, I felt a bit nervous. Yes, when once the lower topsail sheet carried away, and that was a chain sheet, And the chain was flogging around there in the rigging against the yard in the middle of the night, that you could see the sparks flying. It was like fireworks. And if anybody had been there, he would have been killed. So all we could do was clew up the sail quick smart and furl it. Yes, we go in midwinter, round in the Horn in midwinter, we got an easterly gale, which can happen sometimes. And we had to tack again, or try and tack against this gale. We were hove to, and we were driven down to about 58 or 59 south. And a heavy easterly sea was running. But that didn't last long. Of course, the wind changed to westerly or southwesterly. And then we were doing good speed, say about 12 knots against this easterly swell. And she buried her bowsprit and her forecastle head under water. And the chief officer told me afterwards that we were driven back around Cape Horn. So we ran at Cape Horn 3 times, including one east to west. That was in the Lowhill. And she was a very old ship. She was over 50 years old. And she was rotten. And all of us wondered how much could she stand before she fell to pieces. But she must have been very strongly built.